Welcome to Journeys Through Sociology, a series of interviews with the Executive Committee of the International Sociological Association. I'm your host, Lale Bebohanyan, and our guest today is Dr. Vineeta Sinha, who's joining us from Singapore. Dr. Sinha is an associate professor and the deputy head of the Department of Sociology at the National University of Singapore. She did her own undergraduate study there before going on to earn her PhD in anthropology at Johns Hopkins University in the U.S. Dr. Sinha has done extensive ethnographic research, particularly on issues relating to religion. For example, she's explored diasporic forms of Hindu religiosity, as well as looking at the relationship between the state and religion in contemporary Singapore. She's also, in addition to her work on religion, done research on the healthcare system in Singapore. And not only is she currently serving on the executive committee of the ISA, but she's also the editor of the ISA's new e-symposium. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Sinha.
Thank you, Lale.
Thank you. And I want to particularly say how appreciative we are given the 15-hour time difference between you in Singapore and us here in California. So we appreciate you doing this interview so early in the morning.
Not at all.
So, Dr. Sinha, I'd like to actually begin by just asking you perhaps to share a little bit about whatever aspect of your work as a sociologist you're currently most excited about.
Yeah. Thank you, first of all, for this opportunity. I'm really looking forward to having this conversation. I would like to begin by saying that, like most sociologists, we like to see our teaching and research as integrated efforts. But I would still have to say that the thing that excites me most about my work at the moment is the research that I'm doing. And part of this has to do with the fact that, in a sense, I'm continuing to work on a very old field. As you mentioned, I do work on research in the diaspora, in particular looking at forms of Hindu religiosity in the diaspora. And I've been working with this field for the last 20 years, at least. And although it's a very small Hindu community in Singapore that I work on, I'm constantly excited by the discoveries that I make. So in a sense, it's an old field, but it's also a very new field because the more I delve into it, the newer aspects of the phenomenon that I see. And so I would have to say that the research is the most exciting part. And I sort of began to look at the ethnography of the Hindu community in Singapore for my honors thesis many, many years ago. And that's taken me through many different routes, and I've gone from just looking at the Hindu community to looking at Hinduism in the diaspora to looking at the relations between religion and state via my focus on Hinduism. And then now I'm sort of looking at religion and migration, both historically and in the present. So I would have to say it's the research that really excites me at the moment because I am, in a sense, discovering new facets of an old field that I've been looking at. And I say it's the research that's exciting, but it really becomes alive in a sense when I'm able to talk about it in my teaching. So, I do get sustenance from the teaching because I discuss many of these ideas that I see in the field in my classes. So this semester I'm teaching an honors seminar on religion. And so it's a wonderful opportunity to actually bring in the, whatever research insights I'm getting from the field into the classroom and have discussions with my honors students who actually provide a very important sort of platform for discussing research ideas within a classroom setting. So it's the research really that keeps me going at the moment.
Right. But it sounds like the teaching kind of nourishes that continuously
Absolutely.
for you as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, I think that one of the interesting things about your work, Dr. Sinha, is that in some ways, you're positioned in two fields. You have training in anthropology. You're definitely emphasize use of ethnographic methods, but you also teach in a Department of Sociology. You work with the International Sociological Association. So in terms of your work in sociology, could you maybe just share with us 3 reasons why you have been drawn to sociology throughout your career?
Sure. I think what you said about having a foot in both fields is really a very accurate description of how I came to sociology. Actually, my coming to sociology was somewhat accidental. I was a pre-med student who wanted to study medicine and didn't have enough academic grades to get into the medical faculty. And kind of came into the social sciences and humanities quite accidentally. Once having done that, I found myself in the sociology department, which in Singapore is a joint department. So it's named the sociology department, but we really have anthropologists and sociologists there. So from the very beginning, I've had sort of equal exposure to sociology and anthropology. And I found myself attracted to the qualitative aspect of sociological work that was being done in my department. So, I mean, having come to it quite by accident, I then found sociology very exciting. And I think one of the reasons I found it really exciting was because I had excellent teachers. And I'm sure this is what, everyone says in terms of having sort of role models that you can look up to. But I can really say that I had access to two sets of really good teachers in the form of sociologists and anthropologists, many of whom have carried on to be mentors and have been very important intellectual, inputs into the work that I continue to do. So I have this kind of exposure to both disciplines, and I'm increasingly calling myself an ethnographer. So when people say, "Are you a sociologist?" I'm actually sort of avoiding that disciplinary divide, because I think of ethnography as a space that brings together both sociologists, certainly qualitative sociologists, and anthropologists. So I had excellent teachers. I think that was one very important stimulus in my own life. The other important reason for doing sociology, I think, was because the early lectures that I did in sociology, the first thing they did was that they made me feel very uncomfortable. And, this discomfort level was something that I had to deal with, because I was now exposed to a very different way of thinking. I mean, we speak in our introductory classes about common sense thinking and disciplined thinking. And certainly I came into the classroom as a pre-med student who had no idea that there was a field known as sociology. So some of the things that I was hearing early on made me very uncomfortable, because it was so at odds with what I had been used to thinking about. And this discomfort level, I think, sort of inspired me and made me think about things that I hadn't thought about before. And I thought that, perhaps it's something that I should look at. And maybe I just liked the discomfort levels, the fact that I was going into class every week and having my teachers say to me, you've been thinking like this, but really, do you want to think like this? Don't you want to think differently? And I think from the beginning, what I liked about sociology was its capacity to give me an alternative way of looking at things. And I think this sort of, capacity for differences within a discipline that was nonetheless so dominated by particular ways of thinking really drew me to it, because I felt that, even if I thought differently and I had a very unconventional way of looking at things, that would find some kind of a legitimate space within sociological thinking and theorizing. And so that I would say was my second sort of important influence, just having the space to think differently and alternatively was really important.
Which must, I imagine, shape the way that you teach sociology today.
Both in terms of how I conduct myself in the classroom today, as well as the kind of research that I've continued to do. So, I mean, when I look at the kind of research that I've done subsequently, although it's ethnographic, it's also, for example, dealing with fields that are defined marginal. I do work on the Hindu community in Singapore, which is barely 4% of the total population. I mean, in terms of absolute numbers, it's a tiny community, and very often I've been asked, well, why do you work on this community? It's such a small community. It's not really that significant within the Singapore context, but, intellectually I found that very vibrant, very dynamic field. So my research choices have, in a sense, reflected the sort of early attraction to alternative and marginalized ways of looking at things. And so, my research has been shaped by that understanding, and so has my teaching. I try to adopt different pedagogical styles in teaching.
So it seems like one of the reasons you were drawn was in many ways just through this kind of merging of sociology and anthropology.
Yes.
Another was being kind of inspired by the ability to think in new ways in sociology. And what would you say is the third kind of reason?
Yeah. The third reason I would have to say has to do with ethnography itself. I mean, I think I found in the ethnographic method as well as theorizing, a space that I felt very comfortable with, very much at home with. I don't want to exoticize or glamorize fieldwork, because I know that's very much something that happens, and I'm very critical of that myself. But I do have to say that I found fieldwork something that was very much within my own comfort zones, and I felt an affinity with the whole idea of doing fieldwork, and it excited me back when I was an undergraduate student, and I have to say it continues to excite me today. So after sort of many months of not having an opportunity to do fieldwork, when I'm finally in the field, and I have to say that my field is where I live, which is also very interesting because I am from India. I came to Singapore when I was a child, when I was a 12-year-old actually, and I've grown up in Singapore. And for various reasons, I've chosen to do fieldwork in Singapore, which is an urban space. So it doesn't really have the sort of features of an exotic field setting. But I do fieldwork where I live, and yet I find the whole enterprise really exciting. So I think ethnography has been one major sort of attraction for me to continue to do to do sociology.
I think it's interesting that when the way that you talk about ethnography in your case, where you're, as you say, someplace that is quite familiar to you. We recently did an interview with Michael Buravoy, who also talked a lot about ethnography and fieldwork. But in his case, it was doing fieldwork in places that were not familiar. And for him, the greatest value or the greatest knowledge that came about in doing that fieldwork was in some ways the discomfort that he felt. And he talked a lot about being kind of inept in those contexts and feeling humiliated in ways that he learned a great deal from. So in your case, when you're doing ethnographic work in a place that is familiar to you, what do you think are either some of the advantages, some of the challenges of approaching ethnography in that way?
Yeah, that's really interesting what Michael said, and I can completely understand that, because even though I do fieldwork in a familiar space, and Singapore is a very tiny island nation state, as you know, I was surprised at how little I knew of Singapore as well. So in many ways, it's a familiar space, but there are aspects of it which are completely new to me, and I think that's part of the excitement of discovery that, in your own backyard, there are things happening that you never knew about. So I would probably share some of the concerns that Michael has expressed, but I think one of the challenges that I've faced as a sociologist or an ethnographer is precisely in having to do fieldwork in familiar spaces. And I'm actually struggling to write a paper about this at the moment, where I'm sort of thinking of fieldwork in familiar places as a blessing and a burden at the same time. Because it's a blessing because I can do fieldwork anytime I want to. And it's a burden in some sense because you are never out of field. I'm always in the field, and you develop relationships with your informants which far transcend the sort of typical fieldworker informant relationship. And so some of the people I do fieldwork with I have known for the past 10 years, and they've become friends. Some of them have become more than friends. And I think one of the challenges of doing fieldwork in a familiar place is to constantly be in the field and never be out of it and never have the option of getting out, because I think there is some benefit to a distance from fieldwork and from the field as well. I don't really get an opportunity to do that because I'm always plugged in. So these days with email and SMSs and phone calls, I'm always in the know about what's happening, whether I am in a fieldwork moment or not, because there are times when I do want to switch off, and there are times when I don't really want to think about what's happening in the field, what festival is being celebrated, which temple has been demolished. I mean, of course, it's a blessing as well to have access to this kind of information all the time. But I think sometimes there is an information overload.
Yes.
And I say that with some caution, because I appreciate, being embedded in a field where I can just go and do fieldwork anytime I want to do. But the challenge is that, I'm in the field all the time, and I don't get sustained periods of fieldwork. So my fieldwork experience is actually very different from somebody who leaves home to go away for 6 months or 3 months or a year. I mean, that's a luxury. Whereas I end up doing fieldwork in very segmented ways. So I do fieldwork during lunch breaks. I do fieldwork after office hours. I do it at MRT, at train stations. I do it in office rooms. And So these are the sort of dynamics of doing fieldwork in urban places as well, because people have very busy lives and they can fit you in on tea breaks or weekends if you're lucky. So my fieldwork period, in a sense, is very long, right? Because I don't get sustained 6 months off just to go and sit with people and do fieldwork. So it's prolonged in the sense that sometimes it takes me a year of fieldwork on weekends to collect information that maybe other people can collect in 3 months. So I mean, it's as I said, I'm thinking about it both in terms of a blessing and a burden, and this kind of idea that I can never leave the field, in a sense, is something that I have to deal with.
So in terms of this challenge of a field that doesn't really have boundaries in terms of space and time, I'd actually like to ask you more about this issue of the challenge of being a sociologist, which is a question that I've posed to all of our previous interviewees, and it's been increasingly interesting to see the very different kinds of responses from sociologists in different parts of the world. So could you maybe share with us, 3 perhaps of the challenges that you faced as a sociologist?
Sure. I think one of the biggest challenges that I faced in terms of being a practicing sociologist is actually in my teaching. When I came back with my PhD, I was assigned to teach an essential module in the department, which was called Social Thought and Social Theory, and which is an area that I really enjoy, and I've always been attracted to theory, even as a student. So I was quite excited to teach theory. But when I returned from Johns Hopkins, the one exciting moment was that I was actually assigned to teach theory with my teacher. So that was really exciting. So I was his TA, and he let me do some lectures and things like that. So that was really exciting. It kind of reminded me of the old days. But the other thing that I noticed, and I say this with due respect to my teacher, is that, we were doing the same course outline that I had done as a student myself many, many, many years ago, right? And after coming back with a PhD and sort of having grown and matured as a sociologist, I really thought that, maybe 10 years later, we should be doing things somewhat differently, right? And again, sort of given my interest in pushing boundaries and sort of looking at alternative ways of doing things, I thought that the theory module I was assigned to teach could have been reformulated in a different way. And of course, I was very sort of critical by then of some of the biases that exist in the teaching of classical sociological theory. So I'm referring in particular to the sort of Eurocentric bias as well as the androcentric bias within the teaching of classical theory. So one challenge was to think about how to teach classical theory, which required us to train students, in a particular body of knowledge, while at the same time getting them to be critical about the received wisdom that they were being given. So with a colleague at the department, we sort of reformulated the module, and I'm very pleased to say that in the last 10 years or so that I've been teaching this theory module, we have taken it to a different direction altogether. So now I teach classical theory. Of course, I teach Marx, Weber, Durkheim. That's kind of mainstay of our discipline, but I teach them in a very critical way. And with my colleague, we have also introduced a whole range of other candidates that we consider as examples of social thinkers and theorists. So we've introduced, people who work from non-European parts of the world historically and in the present, as well as women thinkers, which for me has been really important because, I think addressing the kind of androcentric bias within the discipline is really important. And so now I teach Marx, Weber, Durkheim, and I've also introduced the name of Harriet Martineau, who was this British sociologist who actually predates Marx, Weber, and Durkheim, and she was a very important figure in mid-19th century UK, and I now teach her, and I refuse to ghettoize her in a women's module, right? So I teach her alongside Marx, Weber, Durkheim because I think it's important for students to see what she has to offer and to force them to engage with her together with their exposure to the sort of founding fathers of sociology. So I think that's been a challenge. And I have to say that I found the context in NUS at Singapore extremely enabling because, I've never been told that I can't teach a module like this or that, how can you teach a woman thinker who's not as smart as Marx is? You hear some corridor talk and, of course, some colleagues are sort of skeptical of her stature as a theorist and a thinker, but I've never formally, institutionally been disallowed or told that I can't teach whatever I want. So it's been a challenge to change the module and to kind of shift the curriculum, but it's not been a challenge to actually implement it, because I found the intellectual environment here very supportive for that kind of work. And so in a sense, I've kind of come back to this idea of what really attracted me to sociology in the first place, which was the alternative perspective. And so, I mean, if I had to think of one thread that really links me to these early years where I was interested in sociology, it would have to be this exposure to different ways of doing things.
Yes.
So I think that would be one area of challenge.
Wow. Okay.
Another area I think would be fieldwork, and I've already talked about that, this idea of doing ethnography and, doing ethnography in very different places and trying to sort of think about the field in a different way. I mean, as you rightly said, anthropologists or sociologists in the present can't think of the field or can't work with the idea of field as a bounded, isolated space anymore, because the work we do is so global and realistically so. So one of the challenges that I faced as a sociologist in my research has been trying to understand how to conceptualize the field, right? And because I do field work in the Hindu diaspora, it has taken me from Singapore to Malaysia to Tamil Nadu, because, I've sort of understood that you can't talk about the diaspora without understanding some notion of the home. And so although everyone says to me, what do you work on? And I say Singapore, and that often gives a very sort of narrow idea that, well, you work in this little tiny island. But then I struggle to explain to people that, this is where I begin the fieldwork. This is where my inquiries get formulated. But in terms of, the distance that I travel, both intellectually and now literally, it really takes me beyond Singapore. So, for example, recently I finished a book manuscript on religion and commodification, where I looked at how ritual objects, travel from places where they are made to places where they are consumed. I began with Singapore, but then I ended up in Malaysia. A lot of my fieldwork was actually in Malaysia, which is not too far away, but it's still quite a huge, space. And then I also ended up in Tamil Nadu, because the Indian community in Singapore comes from Tamil Nadu primarily, and I needed to go back to Tamil Nadu to sort of trace the linkages. So I'd say one sort of additional challenge has been to think about the field and to sort of articulate that, one is not sort of trapped physically in a space where one begins to do fieldwork, but, intellectually one has to be attentive to sort of these processes that are taking place far away, but, they nonetheless frame the work that you're doing about particular places.
Right. And I mean, it seems like that would be particularly relevant in your case when you're studying issues related to diaspora or migration, but that it actually is an issue that would be the case for any sociologist studying any field, to begin to kind of think about the global or the moving forces that shape the things that we attempt to understand.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I would certainly agree with that. And I mean, this is also, of course, by now reflected in the kind of work that is being produced by sociologists and anthropologists. And I mean, we can no longer, we're still forced to sort of ground your work in a particular place. Very often this has to do with some really practical issues like funding and things like that, because you can't really write into a grant proposal that I'm going to go to 10 places, you're not going to get money for it. But apart from those practical reasons, I think intellectually and at a sociological level, clearly one has to attend to stuff that's happening elsewhere in order to understand stuff that's happening in your backyard. I think that's inevitable by now.
Yes. And the third challenge, you would say?
The third challenge, I will have to say, I haven't talked about the administration part of my work, of which I do quite a lot, by now. And I sort of have a very functional attitude to administrative work, right? I mean, we live in a university system which is highly bureaucratized, and some of the administrative work is inevitable and somebody's got to do it. So I'm quite happy to do it for most part, but, it doesn't really require too much input intellectually, except for my involvement with the International Sociological Association, particularly my work with trying to get the electronic bulletin off the ground. I was appointed editor of what was known in the past as the electronic bulletin. I think it was in 2005, July. I was asked to consider taking the editorship of this new initiative of the ISA. And, this was in a digital format, and this was supposed to be an electronic document. And so there were challenges in trying to sort of institute this idea within an organization that had very different ways of imagining itself, right? So this was the ISA trying to sort of become contemporary and sort of reach out to a different cross-section of sociologists globally. Apart from the sort of practical value of being online, right, and having access to parts of the world which wouldn't otherwise have access to the ISA or its activities. So that was a challenge. And I say that was a challenge because of the way the eBulletin was conceptualized. It's not a peer-reviewed journal, right? And this actually sort of made me think about the status of publications in our lives as sociologists. I mean, we put so much premium on publications, and it's not just publishing and writing, but where you publish that becomes really important, right? So one of the challenges I have faced remains trying to persuade people to contribute articles to the electronic bulletin, because I can't promise that it's an electronic, that it's a peer-reviewed journal, right? It's not. Everybody knows that I solicit papers, I sort of go to conferences, and if I think there's something interesting, then I say to people, would you like to submit it? And I always say, well, you can submit it to me, but after that, you're free to send it anywhere else, right? Because, sociologists are concerned, and I guess rightly so, about what do they stand to gain from placing an article in a particular publication, right? Because our lives as professional sociologists is so tied up to the business of getting credit for the work that we publish, right? So it all translates into brownie points. So it's not just about writing and publishing, but where you publish. And if you publish in good spaces, then you get, more brownie points for that. And we know that our livelihood as a sociologist depends on those kinds of things. I'm very aware of promotion and tenure exercises which look for publications. And so it's been a challenge to try and get people to agree to submit things to me, to a document, to a journal, which is not really a journal, and it doesn't have any tiering rankings. It's doesn't have an impact factor. But, I think the eBulletin was really conceptualized as a space that would enable different kinds of scholarly exchanges without the concern for, is this going to get me good points, and will I get promoted on the basis of getting an article published here? So, I really imagined it as that kind of a free-flowing sort of global, plural space where people could just share their ideas and, be reflective in their writing, and in order to kind of interact with other sociologists who may share similar concerns. So that's been a challenge.
And I know that, or I believe that you've recently transformed the eBulletin into what you now call the eSymposium.
Yes,
could you tell us a little bit about that transformation?
Yeah. So the eBulletin has now sort of, transformed into the eSymposium. And part of the reason for that was to try and make it even more contemporary, right? So given this sort of concern with encouraging interaction and exchanges, we've sort of moved to a format which allows greater immediacy on the part of readers. So people can submit papers, but there's also an option for making commentaries, for example, right, immediately. Whether this will be picked up is yet to be seen, because these are new days. We've just done the second issue of the eSymposium only, although the eBulletin has been published for the last 6 years, but I've only just done the second issue. But, what we've done is that we've tried to introduce a medium through which readers and critics can sort of, mount their criticism or their feedback almost immediately, which the authors will have access to, and, which the authors can then respond to as well. So that's really one sort of new
So it's much more interactive.
And that's how I had imagined the eBulletin in the first place. But it's interesting that any piece of writing in our discipline tends to get value if only it is considered a publication in a peer-reviewed journal or a book chapter with a good publisher. But what about just writing for the sake of sharing ideas and just, facilitating interaction, just writing, old-fashioned writing for the sake of writing, right? I think, that sort of exercise is pretty marginal, because we've all sort of moved to a publishing mode rather than writing and communicating and sharing and interacting more. So we are hoping that the eSymposium in its new mode will sort of return to this perhaps more primary concerns that sociologists have about, I have ideas and I'd like to share these with others, I'd like some feedback, criticize me by all means, but let's engage in a debate. I think that's what the eSymposium for me is about.
So, Dr. Sinha, sadly, we're almost out of time. So I would like to just pose one last question to you, which is, if you hadn't become a sociologist, what might you have liked to have been?
Okay, I think I mentioned right at the start, I was a pre-medical student, so I really wanted to be a medical doctor. That's what I wanted to do. And I thought I wanted to be a biomedical doctor, and indeed I'm still very interested in the field, but my grandfather was a homeopath, and so actually I wanted to be an alternative medical practitioner. That's what I wanted to do.
Wow.
And I had two professions. I thought either of medicine or I would become a classical Hindustani singer, but neither of those happened.
Well, we're very lucky that you became a sociologist. So
Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today, and it's been a really interesting conversation. Thank you very much, Dr. Sinha.
Not at all. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. This has been another Journey Through Sociology with Dr. Vineeta Sinha. Please join us again next time when our guest will be Dr. Jaime Jimenez from the National Autonomous University of Mexico.